Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our movement through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are in fact wanting, that's our goal, to actually engage every single poem in the deathbed edition, starting at the very first poem and moving forward. We're now with Song of Myself, passage 23. Now, we said in earlier lectures, which can be found at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, our assumption is you've been following our stuff. Talks with Walt, that is to say, the 24 poems of inscriptions, the 19 sections of Paumanok, and we've worked now through the 22 sections of Song of Myself as we meet 23. Remember what we said, that many scholars will see sections 20 through 25 as a unit unto itself. In some ways, the poet's mystical experience of self, moving from awakening to purification, acceptance of the body, and along the way having some criticism, analyses of the science of its day. We're going to hear a lot about that here. We'll also remember that the key lines in many ways for reading Song of Myself comes from passage 4. You'll maybe remember it, both in and out of the game, watching and wondering at it, I witness and wait. And then as well, that famous line that comes from the notebooks, I stand for the sunny point of view. I think those two lines taken collectively will help us in our reading here. Now, as we work with passage 23, we want to remind ourselves that one of those key concepts is the Word, the Logos. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the same as in the beginning with God. That John 1 from the Gospel account, verses 1 and 2. Let's now enjoy the way that he will play the game with the word okay, no pun intended. Now, of course, Shakespeare's always standing in the back of Whitman's mind, as we have pointed out before, and the great Harold Bloom, the great commentator, critiquer of so much of Whitman, has pointed out, you really do have to pay attention to Shakespeare to read Whitman well, because Whitman, self-taught for the most part, was so influenced by Shakespeare. And of course, Hamlet, you'll remember the famous words. We've given a full lecture on this at learnstrong.net as well. He'll say it this way: endless unfolding of words of ages, and mine a word of the modern, the word Amnas, a word of the faith that never balks, here or henceforward, it is all the same to me. I accept time, absolutely. It alone is without flaw, it alone rounds and completes all. That mystic, baffling wonder alone completes all. I accept reality and dare not question it. Materialism, first and last in viewing. Hurrah for positive science! Long live exact demonstration! Fetch stonecrop mixed with cedar and branches of lilac. This is the lexicographer. This is the chemist. This made a grammar of the old Cartouches. These mariners put the ship through dangerous unknown seas. This is the geologist. This works with the scalpel. And this is a mathematician. Gentlemen, to you the first honors always. Your facts are useful, and yet they are not my dwelling. I but enter by them to an area of my dwelling, less the reminders of properties told by words, and more the reminders they of life untold and of freedom and extraction. And make short account of neuters and geldings, and favor men and women fully equipped. I beat the gong of revolt, and stop with fugitives and them that plot and conspire. Now, we'll get to this plot and conspire thing, but really this is a poem about the critique of the Logos, the critique of science, and of course, we're going to get to this important word, Amnas. Notice how we'll begin, and so much of this poem has echoes and resonances, not only from Song of Myself, but also starting from Paumanok, right? Especially passage 7, and of course, as well in the inscriptions, go back and look at what we said about eidolons, and the ways in which that word eidolons is going to play out in a poem like this as well. There are things that Hamlet will say to Horatio, there are things that you cannot quite comprehend, right? Remember, as he will speak about that idea that in our philosophy above heaven and earth, right? And here we'll play the same kind of game. Notice, endless unfolding of words of ages, and then you have your exclamation point. That's the punctuation mark in Song of Myself that comes back again and again. And mine, notice repetition of the word, and mine, a word of the modern. The word Amnas. Now, just to pause for a moment, notice this unfolding, this mystery, mystic, as he'll use it in a few lines. The words of ages. In other words, the new is the new. The N-E-W is the K-N-E-W. Everything's cyclical. Mine, he says, a word of the modern. We think about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the modern Prometheus. The word Amnas. Now, in the original 55, Amnas was not capitalized, was not hyphenated. But by this point now, at the deathbed edition, we have both happening, as you can see in your copy. And Amnas is the borrowed word. Now, we saw this right away in starting from the very beginning. I mean, go back to the very, very opening lines of the deathbed edition, right? In the inscription's first poem, oneself I seeing, a simple separate person, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse. So he's taking us right back to the beginning of Song of Myself and to the beginning of Leaves of Grass as he's playing this game with this en masse. By the way, we'll see this a number of times in our studies. We'll see it in Broadway Pageant, passage number 2. We'll see this in drum taps in a poem there. We're going to see this en masse several times, right? That is to say, the great collective, the great bringing together. We cannot help but think of starting from Palmanac, passage 7. Remember, omnes, that is to say, the all, the complete, right? And then he continues with this word for the 4th time. A word of the faith that never balks. And then in the 55 edition, he says, one time as good as another time. Why he edited that one out will be a fascinating question. I'll leave it to you. Here and henceforth, it is all the same to me. I accept, notice it's capitalized, time, absolutely. So in other words, I'm willing, he says, he'll talk materialism here in a bit, I'm willing to accept that the world is the way that it is, and yet I want to have certain kind of faith as well. Notice he continues with this vague antecedent of it, en masse, that is to say, the logos, the word. It alone is without flaw. It alone, notice the repetitions, rounds and completes all. Notice the repetition of all here, taking us again back to omnis. That mystic, baffling wonder alone completes all. Now, there are some who read all of Leaves of Grass and feel like the word of all word is the word wonder. Curiosity, a joy that Whitman has, that everything is so amazing. Watch some 2- or 3-year-old playing with a dandelion, and it's just amazing the way that one can just be blown away by the experience. He'll play that out. Now he's going to talk about science as beginning with the word reality. Notice, I accept reality, capital R, and dare not question it. This makes us think about T.S. Eliot's love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Do I Dare Disturb the Universe? Materialism, first and last imbuing. In other words, Whitman, more than any philosopher or poet that had come before him, wants to bring together, with possible exception obviously of Plato himself, wants to bring together the body and the soul. But he's going to embrace both, which Plato never was quite comfortable with. But notice here, we're going to embrace both body as well as soul. He says, I am willing to accept the materialism of this world. First and last, I recognize everything is made out of the stuff of materialism. And then he'll even go further, and this is this I stand for the sunny point of view. Hurrah, he says, for positive science. Long live exact demonstration. Whitman, of course, living in this time that's such a remarkable time for science and the development of science. We've commented already several times on Darwin. And then he says, fetch stone crop mixed with cedar and branches of lilac. Now it is here that we will turn really quickly to our Nortons for some notes. And it runs like this. Stonecrop is a hardy sedum, some varieties long esteemed in folk medicine as a vulnerary or healing for wounds. It's here mixed with cedar, a tree long associated with graveyards and comfort for the bereaved, as in Whitman's Threonody to Lincoln, right, when lilacs last in the courtyard bloom, where the lilacs function as here as a symbol of love and male companionship. So we're playing around with this idea of fetch stonecrop. This is the lexicographer. Notice now the repetition of all these different kind of scientific, explorative types of peoples. This, the chemist. This made a grammar of the old Carthusius, and we'll come back to Norton's one more time, and he'll tell us that Carthusius are these scroll-shaped carvings, especially prevalent on ancient columns and entablatures. The Egyptian Carthusius on memorials to monarchs bore hieroglyphics of importance. We have to think about Song of Myself, passage 6 with hieroglyphics. In establishing the language, in the mid-50s, Walt Whitman was a frequenter and publicist of Dr. Henry Abbott's Museum of Egyptian Antiquities on Broadway, as we have commented in earlier lectures. In other words, he says, I'm very fascinated by science, even all the way back to the Egyptians themselves. And then he continues, these mariners put the ship through dangerous unknown seas. We have to think of the Odyssey, but of course, we think about all of the amazing science that has transpired in the last 100 or 110 years since Whitman's writing this, the compass, the power of the compass, and all the other marine kinds of technologies that allow us to circumnavigate the coast. This is the geologist. Whitman loves his rocks, and he loves people who love to play with rocks. This works with the scalpel. Whitman loves his doctors, his scientific physicians. And this is a mathematician, if you're counting. That's 7 different scientist types that he is emphasizing here. And then he calls them gentlemen, right? And in the 55 edition, we have some fascinating lines that are left out. He says, I receive you, and I attach and clasp hands with you. In other words, Whitman wants to consider himself a scientist. Now, why he edited this out, again, I'll leave to you. Gentlemen, to you the first honors always, is the way the deathbed edition reads. And then notice all the exclamation points in this poem as well. Your facts are useful, and in the 55 edition he says, and real, and yet they are not my dwelling. Now we're going to get to the heart of the poem, and here it is. Whitman loves to celebrate science, and then he'll turn around and say, this is not really my domain, not my dwelling, as he will say it. I but enter by them, that is to say, creeds and schools and abeyance, from passage 1, right, to an area of my dwelling. In other words, I love science, I love materialism, I'm willing to accept the body, but I'm going to transcend it, include it, but transcend it, and I'm going to give more time and more energy to what he calls my dwelling, something beyond science, something trans-science, we might say. Then we have some interesting lines. These have been edited from the 55 edition, and they're worth our time to listen to the 55 edition after we've read the way that he will present them in the deathbed edition. Less the reminders of properties told my words. Notice we come back to words at the end. And more the reminders they of life untold and of freedom and extraction. Now, I'm going to give you the reading of this from the 55 edition because it is a fascinating set of lines. He says it this way. I am, the way he says it, I am less the reminder of property or qualities and more the reminder of life, and go on the square for my own sake and for others' sakes. On the square here, of course, is Mason language. It's also carpentry language, which, of course, Whitman would know because his daddy was a carpenter. And make short account of neuters and gildings and favor men and women equally equipped. Now, what exactly is Whitman saying here? Well, of course, he's pointing out there is a power of science, but science can only say so much. I think maybe one of the ways that I best think of this is that solid math student of mine sitting in a humanities class that I was lecturing and said, can you please explain to me why this humanities garbage is necessary? Not to insult Mr. McGee, but can you explain it? I am an engineer wannabe, and I love math, and I love science, and I get it. I understand its value, but why this humanities stuff? It's an interesting question. It's the question that Whitman will pose here. Of course, think about this, and this is what I said to my student. You know, here's the thing. Science can tell us how to build buildings and how to build airplanes. Science can tell us why buildings fall down when airplanes fly into them. But science will never tell us if it's the right or the wrong thing to fly airplanes into buildings and kill a large number of people for some silly, insane idea. For that, you need the humanities. That's why we say we are the stories we tell and retell, the stories we accept, and of course the stories we decide to reject. Notice he's not really rejecting the story of science. He's just simply saying it has its domain, its dwelling. I have a little bit different dwelling. And to that degree, he says, I'm far more interested in freedom and extraction. That is to say, I'm far more interested in the implications of freedom, and of course, by definition, free will itself. He says, and make short account of neuters and geldings, in other words, the science of breeding or whatever, and favor men and women equally equipped. Notice men and women here are in balance again, as we've heard this before. So many echoes in this poem of what we've read before. He says, finally, and I'm going to beat the gong of revolt. We can't read lines like this without thinking of course, Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. And stop with fugitives and them that plot and conspire. Many people have read this as a tribute to the whole notion of Guy Fawkes. The idea here being, I'm on the side of the revolters, the fugitives, the plotters, the conspirators. In other words, I am a subverter of all things that are accepted as normal. I'm going to go in a different direction. I live in a different dwelling. Well, how are we going to finish this passage? Well, obviously the rational and the science can only take one so far will be one of the major messages of this poem. And for the poet and his mystical awakening, he's coming to this realization in passage 23. At 2b, I've already mentioned the incredible echoes, and he loves this word, like Amnas and like Amnas. He loves these words that are borrowed words that will have a certain kind of resonance for him. And they're able to adapt to any number of uses. At 3a, well, I mentioned Eidolon's. I would like to as well mention Emerson and Thoreau's views on science. Go back and we've given full lectures on Walden as well as all of the essays of Emerson, and especially the essay of Emerson's Nature. And take a look at the way in which Emerson himself is kind of dancing a certain kind of dance. He is aware of the power of the new science, but he's also aware that that science can only take us so far. And of course, Darwin has already been mentioned. We'll mention him again here. Finally, at 3b, the question, do you agree with the argument that Whitman is making, that there is something transcendent to science itself, and to that degree, science can only take one so far? Or do you define science in a more inclusive kind of way today? How do you play that game out? Just to finish, of course, this makes us think about Ken Wilber's collection of writings, Quantum Questions, which will play that game out. We love that book in 303 because it challenges us, because so many great scientists have said there's something else going on that we just can't completely explain. It is mystic. It is beyond explanation. Mystic is the word that he uses. Well, I hope that this kind of poem is challenging you in one more direction in our talks with Walt. Thank you.